I never thought a simple conversation at home could change how I saw my family forever. At that time, I had moved back in after a painful breakup that left me emotionally drained and financially stretched. I didn't want to be there long. The plan was always temporary. I just needed space to breathe and rebuild. From the first day, I made it clear I would pay rent. I didn't want favors. I wanted respect. My mother accepted the money without hesitation, and I believed that meant we were on equal ground. I worked full-time, kept to myself, and stayed out of everyone's way. I told myself this was adulthood, helping each other, being fair, being responsible. For a while, things felt calm. Quiet dinners. Short conversations. No drama. I thought maybe growing up had finally balanced our relationship. I trusted that my effort mattered. Then one evening, everything shifted. My mother spoke in a soft, almost casual tone, like she was asking about the weather. She explained that my rent would be increased. Not because costs had gone up. Not because we were struggling. But because my younger sister needed help again. The words hit me slowly, one after another, until the meaning became impossible to ignore. I listened. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask why it had to be me. Inside, something cracked. I realized this wasn't about money. It was about expectation. I was expected to carry weight that wasn't mine. I was expected to sacrifice because I always had. My responsibility had quietly become an obligation. What hurt the most wasn't the increase itself. It was how easily it was decided. As if my effort, my healing, and my limits didn't matter. As if I would always adjust, always absorb the pressure, always make room for someone else's mistakes. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of the room I grew up in. The walls felt smaller than ever. I replayed every moment I had stayed silent in the past, every time I had helped without being asked, every time I was told I was strong enough to handle it. I understood then that being quiet had taught them a lesson I never meant to teach. I wasn't angry. I was clear. For the first time, I stopped seeing this as a family situation and started seeing it as a choice. A choice I didn't have to keep making. I told myself I wouldn't argue or explain. I wouldn't beg to be treated fairly. I would simply stop playing the role they had written for me. They thought my silence meant agreement. What they didn't realize was that it meant preparation. My sister Ashley had always lived a very different life than mine. Growing up, it was clear she didn't carry the same expectations. If she failed, someone rushed in to fix it. If I struggled, I was told to stay strong and figure it out. No one ever said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Ashley jumped from one plan to another without thinking about the consequences. One month she was excited about a new job, the next she had quit because it felt too stressful. Bills, deadlines, and commitments never seemed to follow her for long. Whenever things went wrong, our mother stepped in before reality could catch up. I watched this pattern repeat for years. Missed rent, unpaid loans, broken promises, none of it ever landed on Ashley for long. The safety net was always there. And that net was woven from my mother's worry and my quiet cooperation. I was different. I learned early that being dependable earned approval. I worked through college, paid my own expenses, and never asked for help unless I had no choice. I thought that if I stayed responsible, things would balance out. I believed effort would eventually be recognized. Instead, responsibility became my label. Family gatherings made it clearer. Ashley's mistakes were brushed off as phases. My stability was treated as something that could be stretched without breaking. If something needed to be covered, adjusted, or handled, the eyes always turned to me. I didn't complain because I didn't want conflict. I told myself this was what being mature looked like. But maturity shouldn't feel like invisibility. What bothered me wasn't that Ashley struggled. People struggle. What hurt was how normal it felt for my life to pause while hers was protected. My sacrifices were silent and expected. Hers were loud and forgiven. Over time, I stopped being seen as a son with limits and became a solution with no end date. Living under the same roof again made the difference impossible to ignore. Ashley drifted in and out, careless and confident that someone would catch her. I planned every dollar, every step, every future move carefully, knowing no one would save me if I fell. That was when the imbalance stopped feeling emotional and started feeling dangerous. I realized I wasn't just helping anymore. I was being used as a buffer between my sister and reality. The more I gave, the more space she had to avoid growing up. And the worst part was understanding that this wasn't new. It had been building my entire life. I had just never paid the price so directly before. For the first time, I questioned whether staying quiet was loyalty, or just fear of being seen as difficult. That thought stayed with me, heavy and uncomfortable, long after the room went silent. That night, dinner felt heavier than usual. Plates clinked, forks moved slowly, and the usual small talk didn't reach my ears. Then my mother spoke, calm as ever, like she was asking for my opinion about the weather. "Ethan," she said, "we need to talk about your rent. I'm going to need you to pay double starting next month. It's just temporary, for family reasons." I froze. Double? I blinked, hoping I misheard. Temporary sounded harmless, but the words carried weight, heavy enough to sink into my chest. I asked her why. She smiled faintly, almost like this was normal. "Ashley ran into some trouble with her credit cards and bills. She needs help, and this will cover it for a while. You know it's for family, right?" I nodded slowly, taking it in. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't show how much this stung. I said okay, even though inside a storm had started to brew. The calm delivery made it worse. This wasn't an emergency or a plea, it was an expectation. My mother's tone told me she assumed I would comply. My willingness to pay without question was just part of the plan. I looked at Ashley across the table. She was chewing casually, scrolling through her phone, unaffected. She didn't even make eye contact with me. Her life, as usual, continued smoothly, while I sat there quietly absorbing another unfair burden. I realized then that this wasn't about money alone. It was about control, about relying on me to fix something I didn't cause. They had both always known I would pay, that I wouldn't make a fuss. That trust, or maybe expectation, had turned into something else entirely. The betrayal didn't come with yelling or anger. It came with smiles, soft words, and the assumption that my life would bend to theirs. I could feel the unfairness, the imbalance, and the years of being taken for granted all pressing down at once. I said nothing more at the table. I finished my dinner, washed my plate, and went to my room. Alone, I replayed the conversation over and over. Each detail made the calm betrayal sting more sharply. I realized I had been treated not as a son or a brother, but as a bank, steady, reliable, always ready to cover someone else's mistakes. And in that moment, I understood something important: my compliance until now had only made it easier for them to take for granted. I didn't feel anger yet. Not the loud, explosive kind. It was quieter, colder, a careful awareness that things would no longer go unnoticed. I would have to decide how to respond, not out of spite, but to protect myself. That night, I lay awake thinking about what temporary really meant. And I knew one thing for certain: my patience had limits, and this time, I wasn't going to stretch any further without consequences. I said yes without a word. I didn't argue, I didn't complain, and I didn't show my frustration. My mother raised an eyebrow, probably expecting at least a small objection. Ashley looked up briefly, smirking, assuming I was easy to manipulate as always. But inside, everything had changed. For years, my quiet cooperation had been mistaken for weakness. I realized that now. Every time I had bent, covered, or sacrificed, it hadn't built respect, it built expectation. They thought I would always give, always adjust, always carry their burdens. And they were right, up until this moment. That night, I started thinking differently. I pulled out old bills, rent receipts, and copies of the lease I had signed when I first moved in. I began tracking payments, dates, and obligations carefully. I checked the fine print on the lease. I wanted to know exactly where I stood legally and financially. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about understanding. Knowing what I could do and what I couldn't. I made notes about my mother's promises, past conversations about expenses, and the exact amount Ashley had borrowed over the years. I didn't speak to anyone about it. I didn't leave hints. I didn't argue at the dinner table. I planned silently. Even small things became part of my preparation. I started monitoring my bank account more closely, budgeting every dollar, and thinking about how much longer I could tolerate this situation. I didn't need to tell them I was paying attention. That would ruin the advantage. Silence was part of the plan. At the same time, I reflected on how I had handled everything in the past. I remembered moments when I had stepped up, handled crises, and smoothed over mistakes I didn't make. All those times had trained me for this moment, not to fight immediately, but to prepare. I also began thinking about Ashley. She had been careless, reckless, and accustomed to having everything handed to her. But this time I wouldn't be the one fixing her problems. My plan involved no confrontation, no yelling, no accusations. It was about creating consequences that would be unavoidable, fair, and clear. The calmness I displayed surprised them. My mother probably assumed I was still the same son who would quietly comply. Ashley probably thought she would continue skating by without responsibility. They had no idea I was already planning my next moves, carefully mapping out my escape from being used. By the end of the night, I felt a strange mix of clarity and quiet power. I wasn't angry in a loud way. I was focused. I was alert. I had accepted what they wanted from me, but in silence, I had begun shaping the way I would take back control. And for the first time, I knew that my patience could no longer be mistaken for weakness. I was ready to let preparation, not confrontation, become my weapon. After a few weeks, the tension in the house grew worse. Ashley started acting even more entitled than usual. She treated me like I was just part of the furniture, moving around my things, taking my space, and making demands without a second thought. Every request was framed as a favor, but it came with an attitude, like I owed her something for simply existing. My mother reinforced it constantly. Every time I hesitated or suggested limits, she would quietly remind me, "Family helps family, Ethan. You know that." The words were meant to guilt me into compliance, but they only made me more aware of how unfair the situation had become. Helping family didn't mean being used as a personal ATM. One evening, I overheard Ashley talking to one of her friends on the phone. She laughed about the money she had gotten from Mom, bragging that it covered her bills while she did almost nothing to contribute. That's when it hit me, the rent increase wasn't temporary, and it certainly wasn't about teaching responsibility. It was about giving her everything she wanted while expecting me to carry the cost. It became clear that the money wasn't helping Ashley grow. It wasn't teaching her accountability. It was just enabling her behavior, letting her stay careless and dependent. Every time she spent carelessly, I was indirectly paying for it. My contributions were keeping her in a bubble, while my own life was slowly being drained. I started noticing more small things. She left food out, used my things without asking, and interrupted my quiet moments without apology. She even assumed she could make plans that affected the household, like inviting friends over or taking over spaces, without consulting me. It was like living with a stranger who thought I existed only to serve her comfort. The disrespect wasn't limited to Ashley. My mother rarely acknowledged my frustrations, and when she did, it was to remind me that this was for family. Every attempt I made to set boundaries was brushed aside as selfishness. The people who were supposed to love and respect me were treating me like I was optional, a convenient resource, not a person. I realized that staying silent hadn't stopped the disrespect. It had only allowed it to grow. The imbalance that had existed my whole life was now undeniable. I was the responsible one, the one paying the bills, adjusting my life, and sacrificing my time, while Ashley continued to enjoy the benefits without any effort. At that point, I knew I couldn't keep letting this happen. The situation was escalating, and the disrespect was becoming unbearable. If nothing changed, my patience, my money, and my energy would continue to be drained. I didn't want to react in anger, but I knew it was time to take control and let the consequences of their choices begin to show. A few days later, I overheard my mother talking to a friend on the phone. She casually mentioned plans to increase my rent again in the near future, without telling me in advance. She spoke as if it was obvious I would pay, as if my savings and stability were theirs to use whenever needed. Hearing that made something click inside me. This wasn't a one-time situation. This wasn't about a temporary fix for Ashley. It was a long-term plan to take from me, my money, my time, my patience, without any thought for what I needed or deserved. They had been quietly relying on my compliance for years, and now it was about to hit my breaking point. I sat in my room that night, thinking through everything. The calm, polite silence I had kept so far was no longer enough. If I continued to comply, I would be drained completely, financially, emotionally, and mentally. I realized staying quiet had already cost me more than I had admitted to myself. My freedom, my future plans, even my sense of self-respect were all at risk. I thought about Ashley. She had no idea how much I was paying to cover her life while she remained careless and unprepared. My mother had been planning to keep that cycle going, relying on me to solve problems that weren't mine. It was exhausting just to think about it. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them angrily. I wasn't going to argue or beg for fairness. I had learned that shouting or pleading would get me nowhere. Instead, I would let the consequences of their choices speak for themselves. I would take control quietly, efficiently, and firmly. I started reviewing my options. I thought about my finances, my lease, my savings, and what steps I could take to protect myself. I knew I needed to separate myself from this system of expectation and entitlement before it drained me completely. It was no longer about patience or loyalty, it was about survival. For the first time, I felt a mix of clarity and quiet strength. I wasn't angry in the loud sense, but I was resolute. I had tolerated their behavior for too long, and now it was time to change the rules without confrontation. I lay awake, thinking through every detail, imagining how their lives would look when I stopped being their financial safety net. I wasn't planning to hurt them, but I needed them to face reality, to see that my compliance had limits. That night, I understood something vital: silence could be more powerful than anger. By stepping back and allowing consequences to unfold naturally, I could reclaim control of my life without becoming someone I didn't want to be. And in that quiet determination, I felt the first real sense of freedom in a long time. I started putting my plan into action quietly. First, I found a new apartment, somewhere I could finally be independent and have control over my own life. I didn't announce it to anyone, didn't drop hints, and didn't make it a confrontation. I wanted this to be my decision, on my terms, without drama or arguments. Next, I stopped covering shared expenses that weren't mine. Utilities, groceries, small household costs, things I had been quietly paying for years to keep the peace, suddenly became the responsibility of those who belonged there. I didn't make a scene, I just stopped paying. It wasn't rude, it wasn't revenge yet, it was fairness finally being applied. I also documented everything. Every rent payment I had made, every contribution to bills, and every promise or agreement my mother had made about temporary increases. I even noted conversations about Ashley's debts and how they had been handled. I knew that having a clear record would protect me if anything escalated. I wanted no surprises and no excuses. Once I had everything ready, I gave proper notice about moving out. I did it calmly, legally, and clearly. I didn't yell, I didn't plead, I didn't beg. I simply informed them that I would be leaving on a specific date and that I expected all agreements to be respected until then. My tone was firm but polite. There was no room for manipulation, no way for them to twist the situation against me. The silence in my approach made the most impact. No arguments, no accusations, just facts, boundaries, and action. For years, I had reacted politely, absorbed guilt, and tried to keep everyone happy. This time, I was being strategic. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was reclaiming my life. I also started thinking ahead. I organized my finances to ensure I wouldn't be affected by any last-minute demands or excuses. I packed my belongings in stages, keeping my routine normal, so it didn't alert them to the seriousness of my plans. It was quiet, methodical, and controlled. Even Ashley noticed the shift, though she didn't understand it yet. My calm detachment and refusal to continue being the problem solver unsettled her. My mother probably sensed it too, but there was nothing she could say to stop what was already in motion. By the time I handed in my notice, everything was in place. I wasn't reacting out of anger or frustration, I was simply setting boundaries and preparing for life on my terms. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet power. I wasn't seeking revenge with words or anger, I was letting the structure I had built allow the consequences to fall naturally. And I knew, deep down, that this was the most effective way to make them finally see that my patience, and my money, weren't unlimited. The day finally came when I told my mother I was moving out. I did it calmly, without shouting or explaining too much. I simply stated the date I would leave and reminded her of the lease terms. My tone was steady, polite, and firm. The reaction was immediate. My mother's face changed. I could see the panic set in. She suddenly realized that my contributions weren't going to be there anymore. Bills she had assumed I would cover began to feel real. The quiet safety net she relied on was about to vanish. Ashley looked confused at first, then frustrated. She had counted on my money, my reliability, and my willingness to fix everything. Now, the consequences of her carelessness were staring her in the face. She had no plan, no savings, and no ability to handle the household without me quietly carrying the load. My mother tried everything she could think of. She started with guilt, reminding me of all the sacrifices she had made and implying that I owed her. "Family sticks together," she said, "we've done so much for you, Ethan. How can you just leave?" When guilt didn't work, she shifted to anger. Her voice grew louder, and she tried to accuse me of being selfish, ungrateful, and heartless. She painted my decision as a betrayal, even though I had quietly endured so much over the years. Then came emotional manipulation. She reminded me of past hardships, of my younger years, and tried to frame my choice as abandoning family in their time of need. She expected tears, apologies, and concessions, but I didn't give any of that. I stayed calm the entire time. I didn't shout, I didn't argue, and I didn't explain myself beyond the necessary facts. I had prepared for this moment. I had calculated, planned, and positioned myself so that no amount of manipulation could change the outcome. For the first time, I refused to rescue them. I let the reality of their choices hit them. I watched as bills, debts, and responsibilities suddenly became urgent problems they had to face themselves. There was no one to fix Ashley's mistakes or cover her careless spending. The silence from me seemed to make the panic worse. My mother and sister were scrambling, realizing they could no longer take my generosity for granted. I had given them enough warning to be fair, but I wasn't giving them more. As I walked away from that conversation, I felt a strange mix of relief and quiet satisfaction. I hadn't been cruel, but I hadn't enabled them either. For the first time, the responsibility rested entirely on their shoulders, and they had no choice but to face it. In that moment, I understood what it meant to protect yourself while staying calm. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't anger or revenge, it's refusing to be the safety net for people who've taken you for granted for too long. In the days after I gave my notice, the house felt completely different. The calm I had maintained contrasted sharply with the chaos that started to unfold. Suddenly, my mother had to face the reality she had ignored for years. Her favoritism toward Ashley became impossible to hide when the bills and responsibilities landed squarely on her daughter's shoulders. Ashley, for the first time, had to deal with consequences. She could no longer rely on me to cover her mistakes or bail her out. Simple tasks, like paying bills on time or planning for groceries, became real struggles. She complained, panicked, and realized how unprepared she had been. The carefree life she had taken for granted was over. The household dynamic completely shifted. My mother could no longer dictate the rules using my compliance as a tool. Every expectation she had relied on for years crumbled as I stepped back. The comfort and control she had enjoyed melted, and she was forced to confront her own choices. I started receiving calls and messages asking me to reconsider. My mother pleaded for me to stay, to work something out, to help Ashley just a little longer. Ashley herself tried to guilt me, reminding me of all I had done for them. But I stayed calm and firm. I didn't argue, I didn't yell, and I didn't apologize for taking care of my own life. I explained respectfully that my decision was final. I had given enough time and notice. I had planned carefully, and now it was their turn to manage their responsibilities. I refused to be drawn back into a cycle that had drained me for years. Watching them adjust was almost surreal. The panic and frustration I had anticipated were real, but I didn't take pleasure in it. It wasn't revenge in the cruel sense, it was simply the natural outcome of choices they had made. I had set boundaries, and those boundaries were working exactly as they should. Over the next few weeks, my mother and sister struggled to manage household expenses and day-to-day responsibilities. They argued, made mistakes, and finally began to see what life had been like for me all along. The balance of power had shifted. For the first time, they understood that I wasn't an endless source of support. I kept my distance, offering guidance only when absolutely necessary and never compromising my independence. Each challenge they faced reinforced the lesson they had avoided: responsibility isn't optional, and favoring one child over another has real consequences. By stepping back, I didn't destroy them. I gave them a chance to grow, to face reality, and to learn the hard way. And in doing so, I finally reclaimed my own peace and control over my life, showing that strength isn't about anger, it's about setting limits and standing firm. As I settled into my new apartment, I finally felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The quiet hum of my own space, the freedom to make decisions without interference, and the absence of constant tension reminded me how heavy my life had been while living under my mother's roof. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe. I thought back to everything that had happened: the rent increase, Ashley's entitlement, my mother's expectations, and the countless times I had silently carried the weight of their choices. I realized the truth I had been ignoring for too long: loyalty without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. I had given so much, always quietly, always patiently, but it had never been enough to earn fairness or respect. I didn't need to shout, argue, or seek revenge. I simply stopped being exploited. By stepping away calmly, by letting the consequences of their actions unfold naturally, I had finally reclaimed my dignity and independence. There was no triumph in anger, only in clarity and control. As I unpacked my boxes, I reflected on love and family. I understood that real love doesn't demand that only one person sacrifices. True care is mutual, it doesn't rely on one person absorbing all the weight while the others coast. I had spent years in a system that demanded my constant compliance, and stepping away had taught me that boundaries are not selfish, they are essential. The quiet strength I felt wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about protecting myself and acknowledging my own worth. My mother and sister would face the reality they had avoided, and I would not be their safety net anymore. That in itself was justice, not loud, not aggressive, but firm and fair. I thought about Ashley. She would have to navigate responsibility and learn to stand on her own. My mother would have to confront her favoritism and her pattern of relying on me. Neither lesson would be easy, but both were necessary. I felt no satisfaction in their struggle, only a calm recognition that I had done what I needed to do for myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. I could make plans without compromise, manage my finances without worry, and focus on my own life, ambitions, and happiness. Walking away hadn't felt like defeat, it had felt like empowerment. As I sat by the window that evening, watching the city lights, I smiled to myself. Life had given me the opportunity to set things right, not with anger, but with resolve. Sometimes, the strongest response isn't confrontation or revenge. Sometimes, it's simply walking away, standing firm, and allowing life to teach the lessons that others refuse to see. And in that quiet moment, I knew I had finally reclaimed control of my life, my peace, and my future.